Hello, welcome to Life Matters. Well, since I was gone for a while, I'm now back. I've been going around the world trying to find people that would be of tremendous interest to our audience today. And I found one. Her name is Julie-Ann Wilkinson. And Julie's story is a little different than many of the people that we have on the show here. After graduating from college as a nurse, she went to work for an abortionist who, believe it or not, 30 years later or more, 35 or 40 years later, he's still aborting children in Boulder, Colorado. So we welcome Julie to the show. And Julie, how did you ever get involved with abortion? And then what is your ministry today? So maybe you could tell us a little bit about the history of yourself, actually.
Young nurse. In the early 80s, I had started work at a job in Florida where I wasn't from, and wanted to get away from Florida because I'd broken up with somebody, and my best friend from nursing school lived in Boulder, Colorado. So I thought, well, I'll go out there. And I was looking for something local in town because I really didn't want to drive down to Denver when I was unfamiliar with the city and the whole area. But there wasn't anything available in the hospital. So in a classified section, I saw an ad for a family planning clinic. And I thought, well, I'll go check that out. And I wasn't there very long when I realized it was actually an abortion clinic. But unfortunately, due to my upbringing and my general views on life, that did not dissuade me from applying. And it was Warren Hern's abortion clinic, which he is still running to this day. So I took a job there, and even though I thought to myself, well, I'll never be in this situation, I'd never have one, it's probably best for it to be available for some people. That was what I told myself. And I ended up working there for 2.5 years.
And what opened your eyes to, I guess, change your thoughts from, this is not a good thing, or this was a good thing, and now you realize it's not a good thing to abort children?
Well, like I said, there was a part of me that thought, I'll never do that. So I think I already kind of felt somewhat opposed, but as time went by, I would often find my radio station on the FM dial with Dr. James Dobson's channel, and he'd be talking about pro-life issues, which annoyed me at first, but it helped me to think about it. And the Lord was working on my heart. I have no doubt in that. And I thought about it, and I just decided after 2.5 years I didn't really want to be there anymore. And I applied for a job in Denver, and it ended up showing to me that the Lord has a sense of humor, because the job involved being a float pool nurse, which means you go to more than one area, and it was all the levels of the nursery from newborns to sick babies in level 3. And I found that I loved that work so much. And of course, that brought back a lot of memories on what I had been doing for a paycheck not very long before. So in my mind and my heart, I was journeying towards realizing that I was not for abortion anymore. But I was really ashamed of where I'd worked and what I'd done. So I was very cautious about who I told about that story. And in the meantime, I also started hearing Father Frank Pavone's. He would have these little, like 30-second or a minute on the Christian channel where he'd make some kind of remark or story about pro-life. So the combination of all that, I in my heart felt I'm not for those anymore, but I had no one to share that thinking with, because I didn't know anybody else who had left working in an abortion clinic, and I was ashamed of it. So except for very close friends, nobody knew what my background was. So I kept the secret for a lot of years.
So you were there. When did you leave Dr. Hern's office of abortion practice? And were you doing late-term abortions that he does now?
Yeah, at the time, the legal limit in Colorado was 24 weeks. And so, yes, indeed, he would do them right up to 24 weeks. They've changed the law now, unfortunately, and they can legally abort all the way until term now in Colorado, which is just astounding. But yes, I was trained to assist him in everything from first trimester to second trimester, and then all the way up to 24-week pregnancies. So yeah, he was one of like maybe 4 people in the U.S. that would do them that late.
And who were his contemporaries that he palled around with that did late-term
Well,
abortions?
there are a couple in New Mexico. I can't recall the name. Another one was Dr. Carhart, who some people may have heard passed away very recently. Apparently was actually doing abortions up until the day before he died. And then there was another, George Tiller was a good friend of his. And George Tiller was the one who was actually murdered. He attended church, incredibly, and somebody caught up to him in the entrance to his church and killed him. So anyway, I know that the ones are still in New Mexico, and there are probably some others, but those are the big players in the late-term abortions. Interestingly, in Europe, where at least I always think of them as being very liberal and open-minded, no European country allows abortions past 15 weeks. So some people will actually fly to the U.S., to one of the U.S. physicians, to have a late abortion done.
I remember I was testifying on Beacon Hill in Boston, and some woman got up and said that, who was pro-abortion, that she was married and she couldn't afford to fly out to Colorado to do an abortion. It was probably with Warren Hern, and to the hotel and the car, and it was a big burden for her to go ahead and kill the child in her womb. Well, you finished up with Hern in what year? 83 or 84?
It was actually 84. I went back to do a couple of shifts on days they were busy, but I would say that I had completely left it at some point in 85, 86. And then I joined the National Guard and met my husband in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and we moved up there. But once again, and interestingly, again, the Lord's sense of humor, my next job was labor and delivery, which I absolutely loved, seeing babies come into the world alive. But I, again, besides my husband and 3 or 4 friends, I did not share where I'd worked at that time.
Right. Now, just as back then there were very few pregnancy resource centers, there are now about 2,500 to 3,000. Were there any support groups that you could turn to, like Rachel's Vineyard back then, or then there were none, which Abby Johnson has started?
Well, interestingly, I did it occasionally when we finally got a computer with internet. That's a novelty, I'm sure, to anybody young listening. But when we finally did have access, I would occasionally kind of do a search, and I never could find anything. There looked to be something that was geared towards how men, and support for men who had had a partner who had an abortion that they didn't want to have happen. But I didn't see anything for former workers. And like I said, time would go by, and I finally, we had moved to Oklahoma, and once again, there were things called bulletin boards on the internet where you could just get on and chat about subjects. And I found, and you could be anonymous. And I found one that had to do with pro-life. And I said, I wonder if anybody's ever going to start a group for people that used to work in the industry. And somebody responded, and I don't know who it was, and said, you probably need to talk to Abby Johnson. Abby had just started her ministry. And so finally I get a phone call from one of her helpers, and she was holding the first retreat for former workers. And there were 5 of us at that very first retreat.
And what year was that? Was that recently, or?
It would have been,
5 or 6
I'm
years
trying,
ago?
no, it's been a while. It's been, Abby, it's probably been, I would say it's probably been at least 10 years. I should know that because I was one of the first people. But the neat thing, when we got off the shuttle bus, it was a Christian retreat center, and one of the people waiting to greet us was Father Frank Pavone. So that was pretty neat.
Wow.
To be able to actually meet this person whose voice I'd listened to, that whether he knew it or not, it helped kind of coach me along my journey.
Mm-hmm. And for people that are stuck in working in abortion clinics, what are some of the thoughts that they have? Are they, for instance, are they leaving more now than they have in the past because there is a place that they can reference, like Abby Johnson's Then There Were None?
Well, statistically, I don't really know what percentage are. I know that she has assisted, I believe it's over 600 people now who've reached out to her. The thing about abortion clinics that a lot of people don't know, a very small percentage are nurses like myself that can easily get employment elsewhere. Abortion clinics very frequently will hire people who don't really have any medical education at all, and they will train them, but it's not something that they can use elsewhere. So, and they'll usually pay a little more than, let's say, if somebody's doing a nurse assistant type of a job, it's not a very high-paying job in any other area, like in a hospital, but the abortion clinics will pay quite a bit more. So a lot of these people are single moms, and so this is their income. And so that's where Abby's group, she reaches out to give financial and emotional support for people who want to get out of the business, because her philosophy is if there are no abortion workers, there won't be abortions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what do you see your ministry now going forward? What do you hope to do or accomplish?
Well, I hope that when I tell my story, I think it's a little bit of a niche group, because, like I said, many times there are nurses who can, nurses can always get a job, but that doesn't mean that they have had their souls healed at all from the trauma of working in that. And so one of the things Abby's group has done is given people a place to be with someone else who understands, because it's an awful business to be in, and it's a shameful thing. Mm-hmm. And at her retreats that she holds for us, we have a chance to have, guidance with counselors and so forth, and talk through some of these things that we're afraid to talk to anyone else about. And so it is, she calls them healing retreats, and that's really what they are. And some of my dearest friends currently are people I've met who also left the business somewhere in the country. I never knew them before I went to Abby's retreats. Mm-hmm.
And going back to Warren Hern, I think you told me that he wanted to make sure that, for instance, on a D&E abortion, that someone counted all the parts of the body and that sort of thing. What were some of his peculiarities? And my understanding is a bit of a gruff individual. Is that true?
I found him to be that way. He was not someone that he was not a warm personality. I personally believe in this, just my words, that for him it's not just fulfilling a so-called freedom for women. Excuse me, let me take a drink here. But it's also, I believe it's part of a bigger picture for him, that he believes the world's being overpopulated. Excuse me. So he feels very passionately that this is one way to help reduce the population.
So he's a population control person. And
he came out with a book recently.
And what did the book, did you read the book or skim it, or?
I have not seen a copy of it. It's I've just read reviews, and Homo ecophagus is the name of it's a Latin term that means roughly humanity eating Earth. And so he's very concerned that humans are going to destroy the planet and we need less humans. And so, this is something I think that to him is almost a religion. It's, the less people born, the better. And so he's written multiple books. By the time I went to work there in the mid-'80s, he had stacks of copies of his different books he'd written on how to do abortions. And he even had a specific surgical tool. It's not uncommon for surgeons to design a tool that works for whatever surgery they're doing. Well, he had designed one that would make it easier to do a complete abortion. He calls it the Hern. So one of the tools is actually named after him.
And back in that time, were they using ultrasound to look at the baby in the womb, those doctors?
The only thing he would use an ultrasound for was to see if the child's size was at the legal or below. So if there was a possibility after our initial physical exam that she was more than 24 weeks, he had this primitive ultrasound, not like what you have today, and he would measure the skull diameter. And if it was past a certain level, he'd tell her he couldn't do it because he was not interested in breaking the law and possibly losing his practice. I don't think it's because he had any qualms about late cases, but that's what he used the ultrasound for.
What about actually going in and cutting up the child, that sort of thing? Can he see the child being cut up? Is ultrasound used for that, or is it kind of a blind operation?
It was blind at that time. Now, some of them today use ultrasound. If anyone's watched the movie Unplanned, there's it's not an actual ultrasound of a baby, of course. The people who did the movie Unplanned, which is about Abby's conversion, it's a manipulated ultrasound image of a baby trying to get away from the instruments. But I'm sure it's entirely accurate. We know they have feeling.
Right.
Their nerve endings are just fine. So there's no question in my mind that they're trying to escape it. But it's absolutely hopeless because they can't escape those instruments. And sometimes there's if it's a later case where he has it's an all-day procedure if it's later, and he inserts saline into the uterus and causes the placenta to start to break down, and it burns the baby. And sometimes those babies would be delivered intact after they'd passed away, but other times, if it wasn't proceeding and it was near the end of the day, he'd go in and start, piece by piece.
Carving it up. Wow, that's...
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Nathanson, when ultrasound was rather primitive. I mean, he had the movie or the book, The Silent Scream, because he could see the baby moving away from the sharp instruments and screaming when it was being aborted.
I read his book.
You did. And
yes.
So Hern, would he try to hide? Like Abby Johnson had no idea of what she worked at the clinic and was a sales star and all that kind of stuff, but they asked her to come in, and she actually, I guess, got to view the abortion, and that's when her eyes were opened.
Right. Well, it like I said, a lot of them, especially for earlier cases, they don't often use ultrasound. But I think that people's hearts can be hardened.
Earlier cases, that be up to how many weeks of gestation?
Well, when I was working for him, he wasn't using ultrasound for any of them up to 24 weeks. So, but now ultrasounds are much cheaper and much more accurate. So I would suspect that, as in Abby's case, probably ultrasound is used more often, not because they really care how the baby is cut up or comes out, but they want to be sure that they have all the pieces. That's really what the goal is. Mm-hmm. They don't want to puncture the uterus from the inside. Mm-hmm. And they want to because if anything is left behind, she'll have a major infection.
Mm-hmm. So that's sepsis, I presume.
Yes, that's what sepsis is. Absolutely.
What kind of words of advice would you give to women that are kind of caught in the working in an abortion clinic and don't know how to get out? What would you say to them? Well,
I would definitely tell them to call or to go to ProLove, PROLOVE, ProLove.com. That's Abby's group. And there are people on call 24/7. Mm-hmm. And they will help people If they'll help, like I said, they'll help financially. If many times there's a woman, single mom, little kids at home, and she feels trapped in that business and wants to get out, but doesn't know financially how to make it. But there are people that will help people get out of the business, just like we have, as you said, hundreds of pregnancy resource centers to help moms that feel panicked and feel like they cannot support another child. There's so many generous people out there that are willing to help.
Now, I've had Alan Parker Jr. on the show, and he is involved in baby safe havens. Is there much talk about when a person is pregnant, a teenage girl or a woman, is there much talk about baby safe havens out there that say, why don't you just go take your pregnancy to term and give it to a baby safe haven? In other words, you don't actually need abortion.
Yeah. I can't speak to how much of that goes on, but we know they've tried to publicize it. It's perfectly legal for anyone who has a baby to leave it at a fire station or a police station, no questions asked. But the reality is, I think that we have a lot of people raised today to not identify with a pregnancy as being a person. And that's even seen in public schools. I mean, we see what else is going on in public schools where people are taught to not even identify as the sex they were born with. So this invisible child who can't be seen, if no one's telling you that that's a living person with a soul, then you're not, someone without anyone educating them is not going to feel any hard feelings about getting rid of this problem, because that's how many people see it, is just a problem. And we know that there's thousands of families that are desperate to adopt, but if we don't have another voice in the schools giving people that alternative, giving them that encouragement, that's the difficult thing. And parents, I think, need to play a role. My husband and I have 3 daughters, and I made it my mission long before they knew I'd ever worked in a clinic. I made it my mission to teach them that every life is valuable, regardless of how it starts. And that if there was ever an issue of any kind, that they would have our support, because I didn't want it to ever even enter their mind if something like that were to occur. And parents have to be willing to have those conversations, or aunts or uncles. Or the statistic that's one of the most shocking when I tell people is, in any church congregation, 1 in 3 people has a direct first-degree affiliation with abortion. Either the wife's had it, the parishioners had it, one of their daughters, somebody in their circle has had one. That's how prevalent abortion is today.
And finally, as we're wrapping up, I was taken aback this last election cycle about how much money was spent by the pro-abortion side riling up the emotions of women specifically. And what can we do to mitigate, their tenfold advantage? I think they spent about $500 million and we spent about $10 million. So it was like a 50 to 1 advantage for the pro-aborts on television, and they're strictly going emotional on these ads with not really much of a reply from the pro-life side.
Well, it's about the money. It's first of all, of course, we have to pray. We have to pray for people's hearts to turn. But we also, I believe, it doesn't cost anything to be willing to speak out at your church or among your circle of friends about how precious life is. We have to change the conversation and not just ignore it and hope it doesn't happen to our daughter or our granddaughter. We have to be willing to talk and have my pastor allowed me to do a pro-life Sunday in church where I didn't get extremely graphic, but I told the facts and the realities of it. And I had a lot of positive feedback from that. Sometimes it's just being willing to raise that conversation, because the other side has a lot more money, because they are not, Warren's not the only one who thinks there's too many people. Many of the wealthy do also, present company accepted. They want their themselves to keep on, but the rest of us need to quit having babies.
Right.
And we probably can't compete with it financially, but we have to use our voice.
Mm-hmm. Well, Julie-Ann Wilkinson, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We really appreciate it, and we feel that I'm hoping that people will find the show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Thanks for watching and listening. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.